It's Tuesday, February the 16th, and welcome back to GoodFellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast examining social, economic, political, and geopolitical concerns in this time of pandemic. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm a research fellow here at the Hoover Institution, as well as the Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Fellow in Journalism. I'll be your moderator today. One of the joys of moderating is I get to introduce the stars of the show, the GoodFellows. They're all actually Hoover Senior Fellows, but we call them GoodFellows for the fun of it. That begins with John Cochrane. John's an economist, and he is the Rosemary and Jack Anderson Senior Fellow here at the Hoover Institution. Hello, John.
Great to be back. Hi, everybody.
Our second GoodFellow, joining us as per usual from his wilderness outpost and mourning Scotland's loss to Wales in rugby, the one and only Niall Ferguson. Niall's, of course, an eminent scholar. He is a historian and author. He is also the Hoover Institution's Millbank Family Senior Fellow. Hello, Niall.
Thanks, Bill. In Scotland, a defeat, particularly one of such a slim margin, is a moral victory, always.
And our third GoodFellow, the optimist in the crowd, 3 being the operative number because he wore 3 stars on his uniform, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. He is the Hoover Institution's Fuada Michelle Al-Jami Senior Fellow, and he is also the author of the best-selling book, Battlegrounds, A Fight to Defend the Free World. Hello, H.R.
Hi, Bill, John, Neil. Great to be with all of you.
So, gentlemen, we're going to leave America's shores this week, and we're going to travel to the distant region of the Middle East. It raises a lot of questions I'd like for the 3 of you to get into today. I'm curious as to the future of the Abraham Accords, the expected Biden pivot on Iran, the expected Biden pivot on Israel. The President of the United States has yet to speak to the Prime Minister of Israel, apparently. The future of the Gulf states. What's next in this evolution of diplomacy and changing economies and human rights? And if the time is willing and the spirit is willing, perhaps we should also talk, HR in particular, about the future of war. Will there be a third U.S. involvement and engagement there? There have been 2 in the past 30 years. So a lot to cover in a short period of time, so let's get to it. And HR, I'd like you to begin the conversation by parsing some words for me. This is from the White House briefing last February the 12th. A question of a reporter asked Jen Psaki, she is Joe Biden's press secretary. The question, quote, "Can you please just give us a broad sense of what the White House is trying to achieve in the Middle East?" To which Ms. Psaki answered, HR, quote, "Well, again, I think there are ongoing processes and internal interagency processes, one that I think, confirmed an interagency meeting just last week to discuss a range of issues in the Middle East. We've only been here 3.5 weeks, and I think I'm going to let those policy processes see themselves through before we give kind of a complete laydown of what our national security approaches will be to a range of issues." HR, you've stood at that same podium in the James Brady press briefing room in the West Wing of the White House. Would you care to translate what she just said?
Well, it means they don't want to talk about it, right? And it means I think that there is a debate going on within the administration about what our approach is going to be to the Middle East. I mean, there's a tendency, I think, across now multiple administrations to look at the Middle East mainly as a mess to be avoided. And I think if you look at the foreign policy record of the Obama administration, and many of those who have joined the Biden administration came from the Obama administration, that is where their foreign policy record, I think, was most abysmal. Maybe a second to China, but they're maybe tied. And I think mainly because they did see our disengagement from the Middle East as an unmitigated good based on the assumption that, hey, it just can't get worse. Well, actually, whatever you think it can't get worse in the Middle East, it actually can get worse in the Middle East. And our much celebrated disengagement emboldened adversaries in the region, empowered Iran across the Middle East, I think helped to accelerate the horrible cycle of violence and the serial episodes of mass homicide that is the Syrian civil war, that generated a tremendous refugee crisis that affected not only the region, but Europe as well. And then, of course, a big element of it was this Iran nuclear deal, which further empowered Iran with the relief of sanctions. And the flaws in the deal really didn't accomplish the objective of blocking a path to a nuclear weapon. So I know we're going to talk about a lot of this. I think that there's a great deal of trepidation in the region again, a belief that the U.S. is going to disengage again. And so what you're seeing across the region, what we'll probably talk about, I think, for much of this episode, is a whole range of hedging behavior among friends and partners. The suspension of the arms sales to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, the withdrawal of support for Saudi efforts in Yemen, for example. These are all reinforcing, I think, fears of those in the region that the United States will again adopt a policy that will that will make them more reliant on others, on themselves to a certain extent, but also that will empower Iran across the region.
HR, is the issue disengagement or changing sides? More support for Iran, less support for Israel and the UAE and the signatories of the Abraham Accords.
Yeah. Well, it's funny now that I did have that one assignment in Washington in my career. I have a little bit more adept at identifying a story that was leaked by somebody. And one of the stories that was leaked in the last week was this idea that, well, we need a better balance, between our approach to Saudi Arabia and Iran. So it put the two out there as equivalents that need to be balanced. And of course, the balance is shifting against Saudi Arabia and for Iran. The appointment as well as Rob Malley to have a role in this, who was instrumental in alleviating pressure on Iran under this assumption, right, that, hey, Iran is going to become a responsible stakeholder in the region, which is, I think, a complete pipe dream. And Neil, I'm wondering what your read is of these initial shifts. But John, I would say that, I think that you're right. This is this balance sort of approach under really fundamentally flawed assumptions about the nature of the Iranian regime in particular.
I think, HR, what we're seeing is the Obama restoration with respect to the Middle East. And it's very striking in contrast to what's happening with respect to China, where the new administration is essentially continuing the policy that you instituted of treating China as a strategic rival. On the Middle East, they're reverting to the Obama playbook. And that's not too surprising because some of the people in the administration are the very same people who were handling policy back then. And it's striking how wrong they've been. For me, the fascinating thing is how reluctant anybody is in the Biden team to acknowledge that the Trump administration had successes in the Middle East. John Kerry, who was, of course, Obama's Secretary of State and is now coming in as climate czar, actually said there could never be normalization agreements between Israel and the Gulf monarchies. But that, of course, happened. And I'm struck by how few, if any, of those people are ready to acknowledge not only what you said, that the Obama administration did very poorly in the region, but it's even harder, I think, for them to admit that the Trump administration had some significant successes. I've just read a fantastic essay by Shani Moore, an Israeli writer, who goes through what he calls the mistakes made by the peace processors. And I love this term, the peace processors, the professional believers that a peace can be achieved by concessions to the Palestinians, a belief that you can trace all the way back to 1990 and even further. And as he says, the trouble about the Biden administration is its return of the peace processors, and they haven't updated their thinking at all, despite the fact that a new approach under President Trump yielded significant benefits in ways that they would never have foreseen. Is that a fair analysis, do you think?
Yeah, I'll tell you, Neil, I think it is a fair analysis. And I think it stems in large measure from our reluctance to think deeply about problems and challenges that we're facing, and especially to examine the assumptions upon which previous policies were rested. And I mentioned one of them, right? That Iran would, having been welcomed into the international community, would be like the Grinch at Christmas time, right? Their hearts would grow 2 sizes bigger. They would stop the 4-decade-long proxy war. They would give up the nuclear weapons program, and of course, that's not going to happen. I think the other related assumptions are, as you mentioned, that the peace process really rests on concessions to the Palestinian Authority, which really, of course, is excessively weak, and that ignores the record, right? The record of Gaza, for example, where Israel did turn over Gaza only to see Hamas voted in and to have a major security threat on the southern border. So I think what I would recommend is that we pay attention to sort of a John Cochrane-like assessment of incentives, right? What are the proper incentives in the region? What are countries in the region driven by? What is the source of their behavior? And begin with that. I think what's odd about I think worth pointing out about the Abraham Accords is the Abraham Accords themselves are in part a hedging strategy in recognition that if the United States disengages from the region, the best guarantor of some of the Gulf states' security could be Israel, and vice versa, right? They're dependent on each other for security in connection with the threat with which they're concerned, which is Iran. And John, I wonder what your thoughts are about the Abraham Accord and how you see the region from an economic perspective.
Yeah, I'm dying to jump in on the economist view on this, but first I want to be every man here and help our listeners. I think you might start by just laying out when you said sort of the Obama strategy. I get the sense what you mean is pressuring Israel to make concessions to the Palestinian Authority, and I like to distinguish Palestinian Authority rather than Palestinians, trying to appease Iran and get them to play good, and fairly cold relations with the Gulf states and the Saudis, and occasional lines in the sand leading to disasters in Syria. And you might say, okay, what's in the Abraham Accords, especially? Yeah, we kind of know what countries signed them and say they're going to get along, but I think you should give our audience what's below the headline, and then I'll be delighted to jump in on some economics and incentives.
Well, first of all, it's an advance in terms of security, right? This is what we're talking about is the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, and what these accords do is really important from a security perspective for Israel, because really for no other country on earth do conversations begin with "we recognize your right to exist," right? And these countries before, at least from a de jure perspective, did not recognize Israel's right to exist. So it's important for Israel from a security perspective, but it also unlocks really tremendous potential, as I mentioned, for intelligence and defense cooperation, by the way, much of which was already ongoing based on the Iranian threat. And then it also unlocks tremendous economic potential. It's interesting that some of the most the obvious and energetic activity that occurred in the wake of the signing of these accords were business executives flying back and forth between these countries, signing letters of agreement, and I think there is going to be a boost to the economies of these countries in a way that hopefully diversifies our economies, integrates them more effectively across the region, as well as with Israel.
Yeah, I mean, so from the Abraham Accord point of view, we know that these oil-dependent countries have been trying to diversify for a long time. Israel, I think somebody said that either the greatest or the worst thing God ever did was to lead the Israelis to lead the Jews to the one place in the Middle East that didn't have any oil. Which meant, though, that they have developed a modern tech economy. They know how to do all sorts of stuff, which is useful to these countries. There's two economic incentives that I know. The first, when I look at the whole Palestinian question, why does the Palestinian Authority remain so intransigent? Because they're paid to do so. I mean, that's their way to stay in power. They're basically, I mean, they haven't had elections in a long time, and the authority itself does very well by the current system, and would be in any sort of peaceful democratic system, they would be gone. And the U.S. and the UN and many other people have been responsible for paying to keep them intransigent for years and years. The thing I noticed sort of in between the lines of the Abraham Accords, and this will be a question because you know it better than I do, but I followed with interest some of the Jared Kushner proposals, and which are part of the Accords, to say, look, we've been at this two-state business and peace first and everything else second for 40 years. It's not going anywhere. Why don't we let the Palestinians get rich first? Why don't we allow, in my words, allow development? The proposals were a little bit too top-down, state-centric, but certainly as a strategic proposal, let's forget about negotiating every square inch of Jerusalem, what's yours, what's mine. Let us get business and wealth going, either connections between the Palestinian Arabs and the rest of the Arab world, or connections with them with Israel. But if economic development came first, people would find an interest in being more peaceful, and would also find that their interests don't lie with the Palestinian Authority. That was very much in between the lines. But that part of the Abraham Accords, the idea that the solution to this whole problem in the Palestinian areas is not a grand negotiated settlement with the Palestinian Authority, but rather economic development, which Israel needs a little bit of push to let them develop economically, and the Arab states need a little bit of push. But that strategic vision struck me as a very interesting one. Now, to form this as a question, is this still alive? Where is this in the Abraham Accords? What do you have to say about it?
Well, I think some people may have forgotten that there was a Trump administration peace proposal between Israel and the Palestinians. The Palestinians did not participate in the development of that proposal, and it was much pilloried by those who were part of kind of the professional Israeli-Palestinian negotiating class that hasn't been able to get very far, in recent years, beyond Oslo and the two states, the idea, of a two-state solution. But the value of it is it's something that can be put on the shelf and can show, okay, this is a proposal with which Israel could live, right, from a security perspective, as a basis for negotiation with a Palestinian Authority that emerges, that is now very weak and fragmented, is also part of the part of the problem. So, Neil, I'd love to hear what you think about this, about what the possibilities are for the future. I think they're very slim, if not zero, for any kind of enduring peace settlement between Israel and the Palestinians. So it does make sense, right, to do the best you can to try to at least end the Palestinian people's status as refugees, try to help their economy gain a degree of vibrancy, to move closer to alleviate the unemployment problem and so forth, as you work so-called outside in with Gulf states to incentivize those states and others playing a more positive role in getting to an enduring settlement. And Neil, I'm giving you a lot to comment on, but the dilemma that Israel's facing is well known. How do you solve the dilemma between Israel wanting to remain a Jewish democratic state? How do you reconcile that with what appear to be diminishing opportunities for a two-state solution? If you abandon the two-state solution, you also place Israel as Israel's future as a Jewish democratic state in jeopardy. And I think that's what Israeli leaders are going to have to cope with after this national election, which is going to just happen in a few weeks.
So quick, I just want to push in that do you do
Hey, John.
politics first and then economics, or is the route to the political solution let them get rich, because people who are busy getting rich and starting stores don't have much interest in fighting about things? Okay.
Well, that was the idea. It was certainly very much in Jared Kushner's mind, but I think there's a different way of looking at it. I mean, it's difficult to make money in the kind of context that the Palestinian Authority creates, and so you have a chicken and egg problem there. But I think what was right about the Trump administration's approach was simply to make it clear that this wasn't the top priority. What the peace processors have insisted for decades is that you can't have peace in the Middle East unless you solve this problem. But in truth, the problem's insoluble. So better to stop prioritizing it. And I think part of what we need to recognize as fellows of an American institution in the United States is that the United States is not really master of the future of the Middle East. It is not master of the destinies of any of the key nations. And the real significance of the Abraham Accords is, as HR rightly said, it's a hedge against the post-American Middle East. I think the post-American Middle East is coming. It's been on the way for some time. In fact, I think it was declared by Barack Obama when he was president, when he didn't enforce the pink dotted line, which we thought was a red line with respect to Syria. And he went on television to say, we're not the global policeman, which essentially meant we're not going to call the shots in the Middle East anymore. And Vladimir Putin said, well, in that case, I shall. But I think it's no longer really up to the United States what happens. And this is really where it gets complicated, because it's a multiplayer game in which neither the United States nor, for that matter, Russia really has the power to dictate. And the key shift was Israel's prioritization of the Iran threat. That was Benjamin Netanyahu's contribution strategically, and the recognition of the Arabs, particularly the Gulf Arabs, that they really needed to align themselves with Israel in a post-American Middle East where clearly Iran was a major regional threat. That seems to me that the geopolitical shift, and all that happened was that the Trump administration kind of went along with that. The peace processors sat on the sidelines and sniped, and they made a succession of wrong predictions. Example, Peter Beinart, if you move the embassy to Jerusalem, there will be an intifada. Completely wrong. Another prediction, if you have a strict fence between Israel and the West Bank, you will not stop the suicide bombers. Actually, it stopped the suicide bombers. If you hang on to the Golan Heights, there'll never be peace. Martin Indyk made that argument, former US ambassador to Israel. Actually, it proved to be extremely important for Israel to have retained the Golan, given what was happening right next door in the Syrian civil war. The belief that somehow Turkey could be a helpful actor, which was an Obama objective, an Obama idea. The Trump administration in some ways carried on with it. Erdogan was never going to be a useful, honest broker, or indeed a reliable ally to the United States in the region. And I could go on. So the peace processors have had an analytical framework that has been wrong again and again and again. Oh, if you take out key players in the Iranian regime, there will be a terrible backlash and the region will erupt. I'm still waiting for the eruption post Soleimani's assassination. Conclusion, the framework of the foreign policy establishment on the Middle East has been wrong so often that any rational person would discard it. And what is happening right now is that the key players are making their own decisions with minimal influence from the Biden administration, which, as HR said, doesn't even know what its policy is, except that it's probably the old policy of the Obama administration. I think that's where we are.
But let me state that even more forcefully. And in some sense, we made a mistake here by starting with the Israeli-Palestinian question, because I think what all the parties have recognized as the truth is that's not the key. There's this old fable that that's the key, and then once you solve that, everything else is kumbaya, which was, of course, a complete fantasy, but kept on only so long as the United States was active. In some sense, the U.S. disengaging from the Middle East, I'm going to challenge you, HR, on this, maybe, might have been the greatest thing that ever happened, because the Israelis and the Arab Gulf states and even the Saudis are now, oh my God, we're on our own here, and there's this Iran thing, and we better do something about it. And we can no longer keep up this fiction that, yes, Washington pressured the Israelis, Palestinians, and you guys want to live in that dream world if you want. Whereas the fact of the Middle East is that's a boiling sore, which has been there for 40 years and will continue likely for another long time. But compared to Iran, Syria, Lebanon falling apart, Yemen in civil war, possible unrest in Saudi Arabia, everything else in the Middle East is so much worse and so much active and so much more salient that what they did was the U.S. disengaged, and then they just said, well, that's something we don't have to pretend anymore that that's the crucial problem. Now we got a whole bunch of other problems, and we better take care of them on our own, because the U.S. is not only, as Neil said, when they do pay attention, completely in a dream world, but now the U.S. isn't paying attention anymore. So if someone's going to stop the Iranians, it's going to be us.
HR, I've got a question. One of the things to which I cannot find an answer is, why does the Iranian regime even hang together? The Iranian economy is a disaster. It was a disaster before COVID-19. They then had an exceptionally bad experience in the pandemic, so far as we can work out, though who knows whether to believe the statistics from Iran. This is a regime which ought to be one of the weakest in the region, and yet we act like it is a formidable power.
Right.
So how do you think about this? I know it's something you've written about in Battlegrounds, but I kind of appreciate an update on how you think about the Iranian regime domestically. Clearly, there's a significant proportion of the Iranian population that is not on board with the theocracy. I've often heard it said, and maybe you agree, that if it went to popular sentiment rather than leadership elites, Iran is actually a more pro-American state than almost any Arab state in terms of popular sentiment. And so I'm kind of puzzled by where Iran's future lies. Sometimes we act as if its regime will just be there forever and its nuclear program will always be there, and we just have to kind of work out how to contain it. But maybe we're missing the real story here, which is this is a dying regime that is losing legitimacy almost as fast as it's losing wealth.
It's certainly, if it's not a dying regime, Neil, it is a regime that has been weakened tremendously. And I would say it has been weakened tremendously mainly because of the kleptocratic theological dictatorship, the theocracy that the Iranian people are forced to live under. So I don't think we should take credit with our sanctions for the stagnation of the Iranian economy or the plight of the Iranian people, who live in a country with tremendous resources, but resources that are squandered by the regime. But the sanctions did have a significant effect, and I think the Trump administration approach generally, which was to force Iran to make a choice, right? You can either be a responsible nation and be treated as such and be integrated into the international economy, or you can continue to be the world's greatest state sponsor of terrorists and continue to foment and fuel these proxy wars that have created so much human suffering and insecurity across the region, and suffer the consequences. But how do they stay in power? An Iranian friend told me one time, he said, stability in Iran is a myth. And essentially, Neil, he was making your point that, hey, this is not a monolithic country. This is not a country in which people appreciate the state policing their thoughts. This is a country that has a rich cultural heritage that values the sovereignty of individuals. That has a vibrant cultural and literary history. And so, I think that we have to ask them, okay, well, how does this regime survive? How do they do it? Well, they do it by maintaining the mechanisms of power. Obviously, they have created ideological sources of strength with this vilayat al-faqih, this rule of the jurisprudence, and some people buy into that, especially in more conservative rural areas. But the main mechanisms of control are force, right? A very brutal intelligence arm, backed up by the Basij, which is an element of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps that will beat anyone into submission, as we've seen with the arrests and the shootings and the bludgeonings that have occurred in even just the most recent protests in Iran. And then there are economic mechanisms of power through these bunyads, which are essentially collective ownership organizations of most of the companies. I mean, the biggest companies in Iran, the beneficial owners of the biggest construction companies, the biggest you name it companies, are these bunyads, who are mainly the offspring of the clerical order or members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. And again, it's one of these assumptions, right? That, hey, if we open up to Iran, more businesses will profit, and then an alternative power base will emerge that can challenge the conservatives in the government. Well, no, actually, the alleviation of sanctions strengthened that order because it gave them more cash to maintain what are essentially criminalized patronage networks. So, I think that the economic dimension of this policy is important to keep in place. I was encouraged a little bit, by the testimony of the Secretary of State Tony Blinken, because when he was asked about Iran, he didn't say we should alleviate sanctions right away. He did say that the regime would have to go back into compliance with the deal before there was any talk of alleviation of sanctions. And I think most importantly, he talked about the nuclear deal's flaws, not including the missile program and the sunset clause. But he also talked about the need to connect Iran stopping or reducing dramatically its support for terrorists and militias with any kind of a new deal. So we'll see what happens. I think there's a debate going on in this administration, and I hope that it will come down in favor of a tougher approach toward Iran.
Can I follow that up with a question about the other big player? And you already alluded to the fact that the Biden administration sounds like it wants to sort of be equidistant with respect to Iran and Saudi Arabia, or at least take a tougher line towards Saudi. Some of you may already have seen a documentary, The Dissident, that is a pretty hard-hitting account of the Khashoggi murder. It's part of, I think, a really quite profound backlash that is happening in the West towards Saudi Arabia, and particularly towards Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And it's a paradox that I think you can help us resolve. In some ways, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, appeared to be and still appears to be someone who wants to modernize the kingdom. So you gave a great account of how you think about Iran's inner life. Can you do the same for Saudi Arabia's inner life? Because it's almost an equally puzzling phenomenon. And I still struggle with it myself. I never quite know how to think about Saudi and whether I should kind of take the line that the documentary The Dissident takes, or recognize that maybe there is some modernization going on here under MBS.
Right. Well, obviously it's mixed, and it's really difficult to overstate the horror of Jamal Khashoggi's murder and dismemberment. And it's worth pointing out that not only was he a member of the press, he was a U.S. resident, right? So I'll tell you, Neil, nobody disappoints like the Saudis, right? I mean, you get rising expectations, and then just prepare for disappointment. But I think that if we don't remain engaged with Saudi Arabia and cultivate that relationship, we lose a degree of influence in encouraging the kind of reforms that Mohammed bin Salman has undertaken. Right now, these reforms, to many of our listeners, will sound kind of ridiculous, right? But how about allowing women to go to movies or to drive cars, or for a non-married couple to be seen together on the streets, or so there have been significant social reforms, and he has a vision which I asked John to comment on its viability for diversifying the kingdom economically, and to do so with a range of green technologies and a new urban center, this city of Neom, which is a futuristic, narrow and long city built in the desert, right? So he has these grand ambitions, which I think a lot of people say this is because he's so young, he is in power, is full of himself, and he makes bad or horrible decisions in connection with the Khashoggi murder. But Neil, I wish I could tell you, what are the dynamics within the Saudi royal family. I think in many ways we understand Iran a little bit better than we understand the power plays that go on within the Saudi royal family. But again, this relationship has an economic history. It has a security history that is colored mainly by access to energy. But John, I'd love to hear your comments on Saudi Arabia, and then maybe also just, the conventional wisdom is, hey, because the United States is now a net energy exporter, why do we care what goes on in the Middle East, right? We're not economically dependent on the region for anything anymore.
So I want to talk about the economics. But first, I want to ask both of you guys a larger question based on what you just interchanged here, especially Neil, the historian, who can bring the big perspective here. Because what we're talking about, so clearly the only way to make sense of our strategy with regard to Iran is we're waiting for regime change. We're trying to keep them from blowing things up really big until the whole thing falls apart by and then something more sensible takes over. But that's fraught. North Korea has stayed in place for a long, long time. Cuba has stayed in place for a long, long time, despite sanctions. So dictatorial regimes seem to be able to stay in place as long as they are willing to undertake the kind of violence that it takes to stay in place.
Maduro, I'd add to that, right?
Yeah, right. Many more. It's when they lose, the Russians lost the moral will to keep shooting their own people, and then it fell apart. That's where, Saudi Arabia wants to reform, but if we look, it's when you start reforming. The Tsar started reforming things. That didn't work out so well for the Tsar. So that's actually, when we look at history, is the end of Iran a nice new regime, or is the end of Iran's regime the way the end of the Syrian regime worked out, or the way the end of the Libyan regime worked out, or the way the end of the French regime worked out in 1790. So the way the end of the Russian regime worked out.
How about closer to home, the Shah in 1979?
Well, I was going to bring that up. You said MBS wants to liberalize. We have an example of a westernized leader who wanted to modernize his country, and that one didn't work out so well for the Shah or for Iran. So clearly our strategy is wait for regime change. But, when you ask the question, how long can this last? It can last as long as they are willing to do the horrible things it takes to stay in power, and it stops when they don't. And then chaos seems to result. So I brought up many countries, and I'm sure Neil has the wider sense of end of regime that can help us try to find not just when it falls apart, when they give up their willingness to shoot their own people if necessary to stay in power, when the forces of a little bit of reform take over to bigger reform, and does it turn into another complete disaster, or how does this turn into the whole Arab Spring turned out not so well, despite great hopes for that process.
That, of course, was another thing that the foreign policy establishment in Washington and New York got fabulously wrong, because they thought that it was glad, confident morning, that some kind of 1776 was unfolding in Tahrir Square in Egypt. And it's important that we talk about Egypt, the most populous of the Arab countries, because I think in some ways the al-Sisi regime is the sort of shape of things to come. What we can see in a bunch of countries, not only in the Middle East, it's also true in Eastern Europe, is that if you have some kind of authoritarian regime with a nationalist element, or a religious element, some degree of participatory democracy, you have a viable system. And it's certainly better than a civil war. The great mistake that was made at the time of the misnamed Arab Springs was to think that support for revolution would lead to good outcomes. What actually happened in Egypt was a counter-revolution. The Muslim Brotherhood regime was overthrown, and the al-Sisi regime took over. And it's a very, very interesting story. By the way, did you know Egypt was one of the few economies last year that achieved economic growth? It's weathered the storm of the pandemic well, like other youthful countries. See India. And what I'm very struck by with al-Sisi is the way he has combined support from the military with support from a middle class that did not want the economy taken over by the Brotherhood. He's also reined in the religious extremists by going to Al-Azhar, the great Islamic university, and saying, we need a Muslim reformation, an extraordinarily important and brave thing for him to say. So I can see the future of politics in some countries in the region taking on that form. The alternative is, of course, state disintegration. We haven't talked about Iraq. It's teetered on the
I was going to go there.
falling apart ever since the Obama administration pulled the plug and simply walked away. I'd love to get HR's latest thoughts on that. But my sense is that that's the choice in the region, that you either have a strong man with some elements of representative government and the fanatics reined in, or you risk a Syrian disintegration, or indeed a Libyan disintegration.
Let me quickly try it, and because I want to be bipartisan, and we're only going back to Obama. The Bush administration had a major failure in Iraq, which I think was equally naive. The idea that democracy consists only of we walk in, we run an election, and then everything's fine. Whereas what I think you're pointing to is what matters is institutions, rule of law, civil society, all of those things that are 99% of what makes America run that isn't elections. And if those things are in place, then you have a hope of a transfer of regime. If those things are not in place or wiped out, then you're going to have chaos afterwards.
I guess that brings us squarely to Iraq. For what it's worth, I think Iraq was salvageable after the surge, and it was a tremendous mistake to give up. But we are where we are, and at this point, as I think you'd agree, HR, the Iraqi state hangs together by a series of pretty slender threads. So what's your current take on the future of Iraq?
And compare and contrast with Afghanistan, which may be in worse place.
Well, I'll tell you, I just want to highlight one thing that we've already just talked about. We've skimmed over quickly is the importance of Egypt, right? Because if we're talking about Egypt, you're talking about a problem of very large scale, right? And Egypt does have a lot of problems. And it also reflects this tension in the region between fear of an Islamist resurgence and the need to allow for more liberal forms of representative government and participation in government. So I do think that we ought to support Egyptian reform over time, and then also I think be more sympathetic to those who are skeptical about Muslim Brotherhood related parties in the region, because they're not Democrats, right? And we know that from the Morsi experience in Egypt as well. And we know it from really some of the groups that Qatar and Turkey are supporting in the region. Hey, Iraq is all of the problems in the region, in microcosm, right? It is a country that is a crazy quilt of ethnicities and religious sects. It is a country in which this cycle of violence between jihadist terrorist organizations who portray themselves as patrons and protectors of Sunni communities who fear evisceration at the hands of Shia militias, that the cycle of violence continues between Sunni and Shia groups within Iraq. That competition is reflected in its politics. It's also reflected within the institutions of government that are themselves battlegrounds between these various groups that are vying for power and resources and survival in the country. Sadly, these groups that are trying to affect state capture to be in a position of relative advantage, they are stakeholders in the weakness of the state, because it's the weakness of the institutions that they occupy that give them impunity and give them the ability to run a broad range of illicit operations and efforts and endeavors that enrich them and increase their power base and increase their patronage base. And so what's needed in Iraq is governmental reform and reform of security forces such that the majority of the population believes that they have a future within some kind of political process. What's impeding that from happening is this idea that this is really a zero-sum game. And a number of competitions are ongoing. I mentioned Sunni Shia, but there's also a Kurd, Arab, Turkmen competition. And there's a competition within each of those populations as well, right? So when Iraq got enmeshed in a civil war, the country shattered, not like a pane of glass, but shattered like a light bulb. And what's necessary are security conditions and sustained mediation by effective leaders to bring them together. Haider al-Abadi, who was a friend of mine, and I knew him back to 2003, the former prime minister, knew him well before he became prime minister. He said, sectarianism and corruption go hand in hand. And these corrupt networks are perpetuating these divides. At the top level of the Iraqi government, you have Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who I've known for years as well. He's the maybe one of the best people to do this, right? Because he actually is an Iraqi nationalist. He actually is someone who doesn't evaluate people by their religious sect or their ethnicity. He wants a better future for his country. The governor of Nineveh province, which was this area where our regiment operated, where there was a crazy civil war going on in microcosm there. That governor is Najm Abed Abdullah al-Jabouri, who was the mayor of Tel Afar when we fought against Al Qaeda in Iraq there, and he's the perfect person to stabilize it. So there are rays of hope, but there are daunting obstacles. And John, I don't know how much you're following Iraq's economy, but with the collapse of oil prices, with the violence, and now COVID, Iraq's debt is growing, maybe beyond what they can service. And so there's an economic dimension, a governance dimension. Okay, so I guess I could sum it up and say it's an ugly picture, but it is, I think, in our interest to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS, because remember, we had to go back when we left last time at a much higher cost, and we can do that with a very small military commitment. And it's in our interest to ensure that Iraq is not completely aligned with Iran. And you know what? That's doable. Iraq is not naturally aligned with Iran. So I think the answer on Iran is for the United States: modest objectives, recognize the limits of our influence, and also what the American people, the costs they're willing to bear after so many years there. But I think this is where a sustained commitment can help get Iraq on a path towards stability over time. I'm sorry to go on, man, but when you ask a question like Iraq discuss, man, I can't. It's tough for me to sum up. John,
on a point of information, it's interesting that oil is rallying at this point from the lows of last year. We're now above $50, and you had Goldman put out a note the other day saying could get to 100. I think the pain of energy transition is coming inexorably to the oil producing nations, but in the short run, they're going to get some real breathing space in 2021 as the world economy bounces back from the pandemic, and I think that's important because ultimately, a lot has been going on here in OPEC Plus, trying to deal with this problem through supply restrictions. A deal with Iran, were it to materialize under Biden, would bring a whole lot more oil into the market. That might depress prices, but right now, the demand side is definitely dominant, and that's going to take the pressure off the oil producers, at least for the next few quarters.
Right. Okay, we're starting to wind down in time here, gentlemen. I'd like to throw one more question at you before we leave today. And while we talk about a post-American Middle East, there's still a U.S. presence in the Middle East. Yesterday, an American contractor was killed by a pro-Iranian missile in the Kurdistan region. We have troops throughout the region. HR, question to you. You have twice served in that region. You twice led troops into combat, the Gulf War and then Iraq after that. Do you think in our lifetime we're going to have a third U.S. involvement in the Middle East? And if so, HR, what would be the trigger?
Yeah, I hope not. I don't think so. But my answer to like how we could prevent it from happening is to remain engaged. I'll tell you, Bill, we keep saying, hey, we're leaving, right? We're leaving, but we don't really leave. But every time we say it, we give up so much of our influence. So I think the real, what we need is a realistic, reasoned approach to the region. We have to recognize that we do have influence there, and we can play a positive role in at least ensuring the situation doesn't get worse for the people of the region or for our interests. But we don't have complete agency over the Middle East. And even if we committed, vast resources, we wouldn't. So I think recognizing both the possibilities associated with a sustained and reasoned and sustainable approach to the Middle East, but also recognizing our limitations is what's key. We swung to extremes in the region, right? From, regime change against Iraq in 2003. And I often say, okay, hey, we always want to debate, should we have invaded Iraq in 2003? Let's debate, like, who the heck thought it would be easy? Why did they think it would be easy? And then we swung toward the disengagement from Iraq in December 2011 that set conditions really for the rise of ISIS and then a return of our forces to the region. So we have very small forces, for example, in Iraq and Syria. Those small forces are important because they give us a degree of political influence. It's not just the military effort. It's the military and diplomatic and economic and law enforcement and intelligence efforts that are important to protecting us from the problems that originate in the region, right? I mean, the Middle East doesn't adhere to Las Vegas rules, right? I mean, what happens there doesn't stay there, and so that's the argument I would make for a reasoned approach to the region, and then and I do think we still have economic interests. We didn't get to hear from John completely on that. Maybe he can wrap it up wrap that into your final question as well, Bill.
John, go ahead. Economy?
Well, the influence question, I do think we need to realize that as we backed up and forced them to stop squabbling and solve their own problems, good things happened. And it's not clear that our influence is used in a consistent and wise manner, following a decades-long clear star of where policy ought to go. So to some extent, a long-run goal of this region is stable enough that you don't need our influence might be a good long-run goal. But I am watching the disaster in Afghanistan. I'm not in favor of immediately pulling out.
Well,
The economic question I would add sort of to what Neil said, there's a pretty flat supply curve of oil at around $50 a barrel, and all sorts of, unless they ban it in the US, which they might, all sorts of supply can come on fairly quickly. And I think the long run plans, the one thing I know for sure is that top-down investments from big government plans have never led to sustained prosperity. So you look at the places that got rich in the world, that made the transition, by the way, to democracy and got rich in the world. They're like Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, places with no natural resources, but very smart people who had to build businesses on their own, as opposed to a lot of oil money that got through into a big project and then wanted to support a people who weren't in the position to start their own businesses and develop their own human capital and so forth. So and this is also true. I think the parts of the Kushner plan that was we're going to make Palestine rich by showering international investment on them is you just got to get out of the way and get entrepreneurial spirit going. That's the only thing that creates wealth. So I don't think that plan is likely to bear fruit either.
Go ahead, Neil.
Well, the post-American Middle East, if that's what we're heading for, is also the post-British or post-Anglo-French Middle East, which is also the post-Ottoman Middle East. And so what we are dealing here with is with a region that has had multiple imperial histories. One of the best historical analogies that I came across recently, which was one of the papers presented at the 2018 Applied History Conference at Hoover, was with the Peace of Westphalia. The argument is that the Middle East is kind of where Europe was in the early 17th century, deeply divided with lots of fragmentary states and ongoing religious conflicts. And how did that end? Well, it didn't end with any one power becoming dominant. It ended with all the powers agreeing on a new set of rules, which we tend to associate with the Peace of Westphalia. Now, could there be a Westphalian outcome in the Middle East? That I think is a really interesting question. It's one that Henry Kissinger has occasionally talked about. That would be an outcome in which all the great powers, all the big players in the region, including the United States, but also including Russia, including Turkey, including the European powers with interests in the region, would sit down with the locals and come up with some new rules of the road that, for example, set some limits on where religious conflicts could go and created some understandings about sovereignty so that a state like Lebanon wasn't constantly being interfered with by its neighbors. I don't know if we'll ever get to that Peace of Westphalia, but it seems to me a more plausible destination than the destination the peace processors still imagine, which is a destination where you get peace in the region because you finally satisfy the Palestinians. If that's still the model in the minds of people in the Biden administration, they're going to waste the next 4 years.
And Neil, you're brilliant, because that one is under the umbrella of the imperial power U.S. and that getting two small nations who are under an imperial umbrella to agree on anything, I'm going to venture historically that never worked.
All right, let's close with a very quick lightning round here. Simple question to the three of you. Neil, you like these questions. John, you're not going to like this, but I'm sorry, I'm going to put you on the spot. And that's
Gives me
this.
time to think.
As we look at the Middle East, gentlemen, I'd like you to offer me just a very large thought or a very bold prediction. Neil, you go first.
My bold prediction is indeed that the United States will continue its retreat from the region, and that there will not be a revolutionary change of regime in any of the key players, and that ultimately violence will diminish in proportion as strong leaders like the Egyptian President al-Sisi are able to impose their authority on the different nation states.
Okay, John, a bold prediction or a grumpy economist blog like Big Thought?
Well, I'll offer the Niall Ferguson bold prediction that something unexpected and terrible is likely to happen. Because, for example, the Iranians are not going to go quietly. And something is going to go boom. And once again, pieties repeated over 50 years have shown to be completely false.
Okay. HR, I'm going to give you the last word. Big Thought, bold prediction.
Well, it can get worse in the Middle East, right? You have the Lebanese state in free fall. You have about 150,000 rockets pointed at Israel from southern Lebanon, more from Gaza. You have the Syrian civil war, which is at a stalemate now in Idlib, but could get much, much worse, and it's a multi-party conflict. You have Yemen, which we haven't talked about, where Iran is endeavoring to gain, a strategic location across the Red Sea and at the Bab el-Mandeb that's dangerous as well. I guess the overall thought I would say is that it is in our interest to help break the cycle of sectarian violence in the region and to help the countries in the region get on a slow path toward greater security and stability. And what I would tell our Arab friends in the region oftentimes is that really it's in the United States' interest to have strong Arab states that are sovereign and respect the sovereignty of their citizens. Iran wants the opposite. So I would just say that I hope that the Biden administration carries that message and strengthens rather than diminishes the relationships that we have with the Arab states, because that's the best way, I think, to have a positive influence in the region over time.
Okay, let's leave it at that, but let's agree to return to this at some future date, because it's not like the Middle East is going to get solved overnight, now is it? So that's it for this episode of GoodFellows. We'll be back next week with a new episode, a new topic. Until then, on behalf of Hoover's GoodFellows, Niall Ferguson, H.R. McMaster, John Cochrane, all of us here at the Hoover Institution, by all means, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll do our best here at the Hoover Institution to help you stay informed. We'll see you in a week.